It's
Very
a
good.
very
but
brief.
I think there is no attendees right now. Maybe we can wait for a second.
I don't mind.
Okay. Welcome to the Palmer Museums of Art's program, An Introduction to the Tavern Collection. I am In Gyung Hwang, a first-year doctoral student in art education and a graduate assistant at the Palmer. I am happy to host this webinar featuring the museum's senior curator, Patrick McGrady. Dr. McGrady will be speaking about a new virtual exhibition, Pennsylvania Scenery, Early Landscape Prints from the Tavern Collection, organized by himself. Hello, Dr. McGrady.
Kyung, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very well, especially on a sunny day like today.
Yeah, I love the weather in the State College. So before we start, this program is being recorded and the video will be posted on the Palmer Museum's YouTube channel within the next week. During the talk, we invite you to put your questions into a Q&A feature. You will find this on the Zoom menu. We will have time at the end of the talk to answer questions. And then I will turn the program over to Dr. McGrady.
Okay, thanks, Kyung. Well, the title of the talk, although we're talking about the special exhibition, Pennsylvania Scenery, the title of the talk is an introduction to the Tavern Collection, and we'll get to the exhibition toward the end. But I really wanted to talk about the Tavern Collection to start, to give a sense of where the works in the exhibition came from. Before we get started, I would like to put in a plug for the next talk in this series of museum conversations, and that's with our museum's assistant director, Joyce Robinson, who will be joined by Mary Judge and Joe Margulis to talk about another exhibition at the museum, Mark Makers, The Language of Abstraction, and that'll be on March 3rd next week. Now, the relationship of our talk to Pennsylvania Scenery well, the exhibition itself was initially to be shown at the museum as a live exhibition during this last summer, during the summer of 2020. Of course, the COVID virus precluded that possibility, and so we decided to present the exhibition as an online exhibition in tandem with another Pennsylvania landscape exhibition, Field Language, which went on view on February 10th. And I placed this notice up from our webpage, mostly because those of you who might have a chance to visit the museum need to know that the exhibition right now is closed due to maintenance issues. And as soon as we get those issues under control, we'll let everyone know when we're able to open that exhibition back up again. Now, the online exhibition pretty much unfolds the way an exhibition within any of the galleries would unfold. And I'll introduce you to the online. We're now online with the exhibition. It has a very nice, I shouldn't say very nice, a short essay that places the exhibition in context to start with. And then you can go and enter the exhibition, which is laid out pretty much chronologically. You can see on the left-hand side the number of works in the exhibition, and you can follow them on a piece-by-piece basis. So if you're walking through the galleries, we'll take a look at this print actually later in the talk, which is laid out here very much the way you would see it on the wall in the exhibition. You have the image and the identification of the image and everything that goes with that. And then, of course, an extended label, texts that extend to place that particular work of art in context. Also under Browse, you can take a look at the entire exhibition under one page if you want to look at other things rather than follow the line of the exhibition. And when you look at those, you can also get a larger image if you want to view the object in detail. And also you can locate the object on a map that we've placed online, so you can get an idea where the location of each one of these landscapes are. Furthermore, when you view the exhibition and look at the various prints, a number of these objects come from other locations. They come from books, magazines, portfolios. And whenever those portfolios are available online, we provide links. For example, this image by James Thakura, Passover South Mountain, comes from the Columbian magazine. And I'll talk more about the Columbian in a bit, but you can click right there and go to exactly where that print is located. There it is in situ. And if you'd like, you can read the Columbian magazine. This is the May 1788 issue. And really at your leisure, the entire span of the entire run of the Columbian magazine is online in a number of locations. So getting back to the exhibition. The online exhibition was organized for us. I mean, the museum organized, but was placed online by the Visual Resources Center in the Department of Art History as one of a series of exhibitions that they have put online for the museum and other museums on campus with their online publication, presentation publication. They developed this in tandem with an initiative by the provost, a strategic initiative to present these online publishing platforms. The first one, as you may recall, was just last year, African Brilliance. And since then, the VRC has produced a number of these exhibitions online. Now, briefly about the Tavern collection. The Tavern restaurant was the brainchild of two Penn State grads, John O'Connor and Ralph Yeager. Both of them graduated Penn State before World War II at different times. They weren't students together at the same time, but both of them fought during World War II. They were in service during World War II. And after the war, they both came back to State College to begin graduate work at Penn State. Because of the housing crunch at the time, they found themselves roommates in their frat house. And so they got to know one another quite well. And in 1948, I'm not sure if they ever finished their graduate programs. John O'Connor was in engineering and Ralph Yeager chemistry. But in 1948, they decided to open the Tavern restaurant right there on College Avenue, just at the foot of the university. And it was a huge success. The first night they opened, they literally sold out all of the food in the house. So they knew that they had a good thing. And really, ever since that first night that they opened, it has been one of the main attractions in State College. And still is today, except as you know, many of you may not know, the restaurant is closed for renovations and will reopen sometime this summer, so I'm told. Now, in addition to great food, they also decorated the restaurant with images having to do with all kinds of Pennsylvania imagery. And we'll view some of that in a bit. Literally floor to ceiling on the walls, everywhere that they could fit an image. And in 1980, a portion of the works that they showed on view in the restaurant were put together in an exhibition at the Museum of Art. It was titled Pennsylvania Prints. And there on the left, you have John O'Connor and Ralph Yeager. Ralph is the person standing at the opening for the exhibition. And on the right is the exhibition catalog that was produced for the show. The show ran during the spring of 1980, roughly January 13th to I think April 13th, if not mistaken. It was extended. The catalog tells you, but it was extended past the catalog date. Now, the print that John and Ralph were looking at is Theodore Polenny's Independence Hall in Philadelphia. You see it's dated 1875, but the title gives 1876. And that's because there was that great centennial in celebration in Philadelphia in 1876. And a number of artists were commissioned to produce images like this. Of course, Independence Hall, historically hugely significant for the history of the United States there in Philadelphia. And a number of other images, mostly lithographs, were produced specifically for the centennial celebration. Now, the museum acquired John and Ralph's collection in 1986. And so we've, since then, the museum has been housing 329 images that used to hang at the tavern restaurant. Now, that collection has some pretty spectacular prints. Two of my favorite here, William Dreiser, a lithograph after Jasper Francis Cropsey's American Autumn, Stroke Valley. They're on the left-hand side. This is a lithograph after a huge painting, huge painting by Cropsey, 5 feet high, 8 feet wide. And it was owned by a man named U.H. Crosby in Chicago. He owned a large art collection because he had enough money from his distilling businesses. He made liquor and made a ton of money in the Chicago area. He decided one thing that Chicago did not have was a good opera house. So he built one and spent an awful lot of his money constructing this extravagantly detailed opera house. It was said to have been one of the most magnificent structures in all of Chicago. But he went bankrupt trying to build this opera company. So he hit on this great idea of having a lottery in which the lottery winners would win a number of major prizes, including 8 paintings from his collection. And one of those was Cropsey's American Autumn, as well as the opera house itself. And so if you purchased 4 or more tickets for this lottery, then you could get a copy of American Autumn, lithographed by William Dreiser, as a gift. Crosby actually commissioned Dreiser to do this lithograph after the painting that he owned. The auction occurred, so the lottery occurred in 1867. Crosby actually won the painting, and he owned like 30,000 tickets. 200,000 tickets were sold. He bought 30,000 of them, so Crosby himself won back his own painting. But the auction house was won by someone in Denver, in Colorado, I think, who sold it back to Crosby for $200,000, which is to say there was over $1 million sold of lottery tickets. His debts were something like $400,000. He paid $200,000 to get the opera house back, and so he was something like $400,000 to the blue. So he made a lot of money on this, and some people suspected that it was all pretty much a setup. In any case, all was for naught. 4 years later, the opera house burned in the Great Chicago Fire, and in the conflagration, Francis Cropsey's painting American Autumn was lost, and so we've lost it. And there's a study that exists, I think, in Toledo, but really the lithograph is a major representation of that. On the right-hand side, Benjamin Franklin Smith view of Pennsylvania Railroad depicts a major bridge across the Susquehanna River constructed by the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was chartered in 1846. And so their initial line was from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, and they needed a way to cross the Susquehanna River. They chose Harrisburg. Harrisburg at the time, a key transportation hub, even before the onslaught of the railroad. And so they knew that they needed to follow the Juniata River to continue further west. And so the logical place to build this bridge was about 5 miles just north of Harrisburg. Another stunning image, brilliantly drawn by Franklin Smith. Now, note that both of these subjects are railroads, and I'll come back to that in a minute. On the left-hand side is the New York and Erie Railroad, which was in function between 1832 and 1861. Technically now, in 1865, it's called the Erie Railroad, as opposed to the New York and Erie. The reason why I point that out is because the New York and Erie built the Sturicka Viaduct, which is a feature of the painting, Cropsey's painting. And so again on the right, the Pennsylvania Railroad, chartered only in 1846, by 1882, it was not only the largest railroad, but also the largest corporation in the world. And I mentioned this idea of the railroads because it'll come back toward the end of our talk. Now, what about the Tavern collection? And in addition to these magnificent images that we have, and very large prints, as you can see, they're both of them 30 inches or more wide. We have images of significant people in Pennsylvania history. On the left is Joseph Ritner. He was governor in 1838, running for re-election. There on the left in this image by Albert Newsom, a lithograph after John Francis. And so he created this pose of a gentleman farmer. He wasn't, of course, but this is how he depicted himself. In order to essentially get across to the folks of Pennsylvania, his roots as a poor country boy, the appeal didn't work. He lost the election in 1838. On the right, James Buchanan, who at the time in 1856, time of this depiction, was the Democratic candidate for the president of the United States. Buchanan was a lifelong politician from Lancaster, lived most of his 40 years in Lancaster. He represented Pennsylvania in both houses of Congress, both as a representative and as a senator. He was U.S. Secretary of State under James Polk. Later, he was ambassador to the United Kingdom. Here, in his bid for the presidency, he actually won and became president in 1856. He preceded Abraham Lincoln, and he's generally considered to be one of our worst presidents, right down there with the bottom of the barrel. Sorry to say, Buchanan, but that's pretty much how history has treated you. Now, one thing to mention about Buchanan's portrait, it's based on a daguerreotype by Matthew Brady, probably just maybe a year earlier. And the reason why I mention this is because photography was a main source for a lot of a significant number of works in the Tavern collection. That is to say, rather than going out into the world for artists to draw a number of the scenes that occur in the collection, artists often work from photographs. Just to let you know, there are many instances of that in the collection. Also, we have military figures. Here, two sheets from the U.S. Military Magazine, published in only for 3 years, 1839 to 1841. And this reflects the prevalence of local militias in the early 19th century throughout the United States, tons of them in Pennsylvania. You see on the left, there's a group from Reading, and on the right is a group from York. The problem is that in 1839, there weren't a lot of wars going on throughout the world, and there wasn't a great deal of call for local militia. And so really, if you look carefully at this period, these militias were somewhat short on military training, and they placed a greater emphasis on social life. And indeed, many of them were little more than gentlemen's clubs, but of course, requiring spiffy uniforms, which they proudly don for these images. And then there's Pennsylvania history. And I got two more of my favorite images from the collection. On the left-hand side is a 1775 engraving after the 1772 painting by Benjamin West. It, of course, is William Penn's treaty with the Lenape people sometime in the 1680s, in which Penn managed to reach an agreement with the Lenape to extend his hold on the Delaware near Philadelphia, further inland. The painting was commissioned by Penn's son, Thomas Penn, in order to keep Pennsylvania under the Penn family control. The crown in England had actually given William Penn and his family almost total control over the lands of Pennsylvania. And this didn't set well with people like Ben Franklin, who was a member of the Philadelphia Assembly during the colonial days. And he spent dozens of years trying to get the crown to change the governance of Pennsylvania. He wanted to place it under British control. And of course, the Penn family wanted to keep it under their control. The revolution a couple years later, of course, put an end to that conflict once and for all. On the right-hand side is the attempt to burn John Harris. John Harris opened a trading post very early in the 18th century, I believe as early as 1709, on the east side of the river near Paxton, which was a Native American village where Harrisburg is now currently located. According to the legend, and I say it's only legend, it more than likely didn't occur the way that it's told. Harris at his trading post denied alcohol to a group of Native Americans who he judged to be already inebriated. The group turned on him and attempted to burn him alive, when just at the last moment, a second group of Native Americans, much more friendly to John Harris, came to his rescue. Now, you gotta have lions. The Nittany lion, of course, the university's mascot, been that way since 1908, so well over 100 years. On the left is one of the prints, of course, it's the mountain lion, it's the Nittany lion, from John James Audubon's Viviparous Quadrupeds of North America. Now, I don't know why he uses viviparous quadrupeds. He could have just said mammals of North America, because there are no mammals in North America that are not quadrupedic and are not, that don't give live birth. But nonetheless, viviparous quadrupeds, it's a series of images that he created between 1845 and 1848. James Audubon, of course, a famous naturalist, well known for the birds of America that he created in 1838, a great collection of images that is collected by all kinds of folks. When he started the next series, which is the mammals of North America, his eyesight had started to fail. And so he asked his sons to step in to do the drawing. And this one was done by his son, John Woodhouse Audubon. And of course, all of the images, all the drawings were then passed over to a man named John Bowen, who was a famous lithographer in Philadelphia, to transfer those drawings to print. And so that's why Bowen is given the actual making of the object, and he's the one who also printed them for posterity. On the right-hand side is an image. It's the Cougar of Pennsylvania. It's an etching from a massive 18th century study of natural history by Georges Louis Leclerc. One of the great things that Leclerc did for our purposes is that he correctly identified a lion here as coming from the genus Puma, not Felis, which is the way that the lion is characterized in the viviparous quadrupeds, and so correctly identifying as properly as Puma concolor. Now, just to give you an idea of size, we often in slideshows, we tend to put things on equal footing. The lithograph on the left-hand side is really about 36 inches wide. The print that comes from the natural history study is much smaller. And so this is more likely what the relationship would be if you actually had them on a table side by side. Now, a large number, a majority, but easily a majority, almost 2/3 of the image in the collection are town views. And a number of those town views, 93 in fact, are by Thaddeus Fowler. To be fair now, Fowler had made quite a few images that are much more brilliantly colored than these, but they were all bird's eye views, which is to say, overviewing the entire town or city from a distance in which you could capture most of the town as it lay below you. And so once you've seen one Fowler, you pretty much can identify his work from that single view. But one of the great advantages is that you get to see what's important for the town. For example, on the left, Altoona, you can see the huge railroad complex there in the center. Altoona was founded by the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1849 as a location for its shop and maintenance complex. And it was the town itself that grew up around the shop. And so you can get a sense of how the town was established. And on the right-hand side, Clearfield, you get a sense of how significant the West Branch of the Susquehanna was. It's there in the center of town. Of course, it provided a resource for a number of the industries that helped to create the town of Clearfield. Now, more interesting to me than these bird's eye views are a bit, I consider to be a bit more artistic approach to the town view. And here's one, Bellefonte, in which the view is not as if a bird was flying overhead, but more at an angle as if you were viewing from a tall building or a hill. In this instance, Half Moon Hill. They're just, I think, north of Bellefonte, or I'm sorry, southeast of Bellefonte. And there you have a group of individuals very nicely dressed, as you can see, enjoying a view of Bellefonte from Half Moon Hill. This kind of print, again, from a hill rather than bird's eye, was actually quite popular in the 1870s. And it's interesting how this particular print came about. There was a notice in the June 28th issue of the Bellefonte Republican, and it read like this: Messrs. C.J. Corbin and Company are in town prospecting with the intention of publishing a view of Bellefonte. The view will be sketched by an experienced artist, subject to the inspection and approval of a committee of our citizens consisting of General James Beaver, Robert Valentine, and J.W. Moore. The publishers seem delighted with the scenery about the town, and think that our village and surroundings will make a view equal to any they have ever published. May they be successful. What's curious about this, the wording of this statement, is that in the other newspaper on the same day, the other second newspaper at the time in Bellefonte was the Democratic Watchman, nearly the identical statement existed. It was a plant by the publisher, C.J. Corbin, and throughout the summer, you would see in both newspapers very similar texts that detail the progress of the print being made. And so it was an advertising ploy on the part of Corbin, who knew that he needed to sell the idea of the print, get subscribers who would buy it before he was able to actually draw the view. And so he's drumming up business. Now, the publisher again is C.J. Corbin. He was from Philadelphia. The person who was drawing the scene, the rest of the and company, was William Wallace Denslow. And yes, before we go too far, it's the same William Wallace Denslow that became very famous for the wonderful Wizard of Oz images. There on the left is one of the color relief prints from Frank Baum's first version of first issue of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from 1900. It's really what made Denslow famous. Matter of fact, he made so much money off of this venture that he was able to buy an island in the Caribbean and make himself, I believe he did this, he made himself king of this island. But before that, he kicked around, and he was doing drawings like this for Corbin and several other publishers, and he worked for newspapers and magazines. He drew, for example, the Montgomery Ward catalog, for example, in the 1870s. And so he was only became famous with The Wizard of Oz. Now, so Corbin planted these articles to drum up business. And so the subscribers were not only people who had agreed to purchase them individually, but you see that at the top, all those vignettes, those are churches and hotels and banks that thought that they could distribute some of these things to the people with whom they're affiliated. And so they chipped in and they paid extra to have their vignettes in this print. And then in the lower right-hand side, you see the Valentine Ironworks. That's because one of the three people that was mentioned by Corbin in the announcement, the Committee of Our Citizens, was Robert Valentine, who owned Valentine, one of the owners of Valentine and Company, which was a mining and manufacturing firm dealing with iron. Huge company for 100 years, the presence of Valentine family in Bellefonte. The other two were J.W. Moore, a local photographer, and then James Beaver, who probably by far the most distinguished member of the group. He was a lawyer in town before the Civil War. When the Civil War came around, he enlisted, became a lieutenant general before it was over, was wounded 4 times. The last time a ball smashed his femur in his right leg, and so he lost his right leg. Didn't stop him. He came back to Bellefonte, became a lawyer, and became involved in politics. He was governor from 1887 to 1891 of Pennsylvania. At the time of this print's production, he was serving as the president of the Board of Trustees at Penn State. And not surprisingly, we have at the same time this view of Pennsylvania State College being done by the same group, Denslow and Corbin publishing it. Beaver brought the idea to the Board of Trustees. They agreed to buy 5,000 copies. And in Beaver's papers at Penn State, there is a letter from a woman who was apologizing that her son had to drop out of Penn State. As I understand that her husband had gotten ill, the son had to come back and work the farm, and she was worried that he would lose his place in the class and in his class, because eventually he would come back. And Beaver wrote to her saying, "No worries, there will always be a place for your son. In the interim, please give this image." Of course, it was one of these lithographs of Penn State. "Please give this to your son so he remembers where we are." This was a nice gesture, and that's how they were used. This is the only one I've ever seen, so I don't know what happened to the other 5,000. Okay. This brings us very quickly to the exhibition. And of course, we're selecting more from the Tavern collection in order to put this exhibition together. And so the question is, what were we looking for? We've looked at images of people who are important for Pennsylvania, historical moments, beautiful landscapes of Pennsylvania. But what were we looking for this particular exhibition? Early landscapes from landscape prints from the Tavern collection. Well, one thing that was important to me is to look at early landscapes, specifically before 1850. That's back when Pennsylvania was much more pastoral than it was in the middle part of the century, which is to say before it was transformed by the railroad especially. Remember, we looked at those railroads at the very beginning, and I'll talk more about them at the very end. Secondly, I was interested in targeting works that had seldom, if ever, been placed on view since the museum purchased or acquired the Tavern collection in 1986. And one of those is this view that we looked at before. We know from the description underneath the image, the legend underneath, that it is a pass. It is a pass on the road between York and Carlisle. That's Route 74 now. Back then it was, as you can see, just merely a dirt road. The pass over the mountain, we know, is over South Mountain, we know is Dill's Gap, today current day Dillsburg, where in 1788 Matthew Dill had a tavern. All of this Dill is because Matthew Dill was responsible for actually helping to build that road between York and Carlisle. He petitioned the Harrisburg for money in order to build the road. And we often wonder whether or not that house there up on the hill was actually Dill's Tavern. Dill's Tavern exists today. It's a different building because son John rebuilt the building, the tavern closer to the Baltimore Pike, which is the road between York and Carlisle. But nonetheless, we wonder whether or not that is what was in Thackeray's mind when he engraved this image after Thomas Bedwell. Neither Thacker or Bedwell probably had ever made the trip between Carlisle and York. There's no reason why they would. They were perfectly happy in Philadelphia. And so they're imagining this scene based on what the editors told them to create. It's a tiny image, 3.5 inches high and 7 inches wide, just perfect for being placed as the frontispiece in the Columbian magazine. Here it is in situ. There on the left is the frontispiece, and Columbia magazine, the May issue 1788, begins right there at the start. We actually have a couple of images in the show from the Columbian. It was a short-lived magazine published between 1786 and 92. Here is, I'm sorry, before I show that, just to give you a description, its subtitle is a miscellany. It's a collection of history, fiction, poetry, biographies, news of the day. It was just a collection of all kinds of literature, a literary magazine of the time. Here's a second one, and this is by actually Thackeray's teacher, James Trenchard. on the view a view on the Juniata River. And in this instance, Trenchard, who was a co-founder of the Columbian Magazine, drew or engraved this image in tandem with an article that was published in the August issue of the magazine. And there it is. It's actually a description of the River Juniata, which is the first article in this monthly. And so the Thacker review of the pass at South Mountain was just a standalone piece. This actually illustrates the article, and the article is important because it tells us more about the location of this particular pass. I'm sorry, back a bit. The article talks about this portion of the Juniata River, which is at Jack's Gap, which is a place on the river which is really quite narrow. It's actually called one of the narrows. It's one of the many narrows in Pennsylvania. And the article talks about how difficult it is to pass this road. As a matter of fact, it's strewn with rocks, and people have to navigate very carefully because the rocks are very dangerous. And half the time the road is underwater because of the flooding of the Juniata. And so if we turn this on its side, there are two people trying to negotiate the road on the left side of the river as it flows toward us. A bit further down, you see a couple people crossing on the boat. Well, the article tells us exactly what that is. That's Drake's Ferry, one of the early ferries across the Juniata, in which these two gentlemen traveling on the road will eventually have to cross at that point in order to continue the road up the Juniata as they move further west. Drake's Ferry was located just a couple of 100 yards west of current day Mount Union today, if you know where that's located. Now, roads and ferries that we've looked at so far, and as I began to put this exhibition together, I began to notice that there was a common theme developing between the objects that we had chosen for the show, and that was depicting how Americans actually navigate the landscape, particularly in the years prior to the development of railroads across the state. Ferries, for example, were very well represented in the Tavern collection. We have two others here in Pennsylvania scenery. On the left is a view of a ferry that is not named on the Susquehanna, but all likelihood is Harris's Ferry, which was constructed by John Harris, a fellow that we saw earlier, almost burned by the Indians. Harris built a ferry in 1733 to cross this point on the Susquehanna. Again, Harris, this location, very crucial for transportation. It was one place that was necessary for crossing in order to get further west. And Harris had been operating it since 1733. Since 1785, the town was known as Harrisburg. And on the right-hand side, you have another ferry further downstream on the Susquehanna called Wright's Ferry. It was actually the first ferry constructed on the Susquehanna in 1730 by John Wright. And it's located now, it's current day Columbia. Here we're looking toward Chickee's Rock, that stunning height abutting the river. It's named for the Chickasalunga Creek. The name is Susquehannock. The creek is just north of Chickee's Rock, and at the town at its base, you can see in white at the base of Chickee's Rock is a town called Wright's Ferry. In 1780, it was renamed Columbia in a failed bid in order to get this location, Wright's Ferry, Columbia, to be the capital of the United States. Not so far-fetched, it lost in Congress by one vote. So we came very close to having the capital of the United States there along the Hudson River. Now, both of these I should back up a bit. Both of these points, these crossings, the Susquehanna were again crucial for crossing the state. Remember, the Susquehanna River bisects the state. North to south. You at one point, if you're traveling in Pennsylvania and want to go west, you've got to cross the Susquehanna. And so at both of these points, bridges only came later in the second decade of the 19th century. At Columbia, the first bridge was built in 1814, and 2 years later, Harrisburg followed in 1816 with its famous Camelback Bridge, which we'll get to in about 5 minutes. But first, let's talk about canals. There were so many canals. Pennsylvania invested heavily in canals. And again, this is before the railroad, heavily in canals after the Erie Canal in New York State became functional. And they were realizing that they were going to be losing an awful lot of business and transportation further west. People would choose to use the Erie Canal because it was it was easy to use. So Pennsylvania, beginning in 1827, began investing heavily in canals, and both of these images show the development of the use of canals in order to navigate the Susquehanna River. Now remember that the Susquehanna River is a very wide river and hugely shallow. You can't navigate on the Susquehanna River unless it's the flood season, the high water season, roughly from March to June. Other than that, you can't get boats to travel on it. And so they needed to build canals along the Susquehanna River, which they did almost the entire length of the Susquehanna. Both of these images come from a very large series. There's actually two of 119 engravings after William Henry Bartlett's drawings of various locations throughout the Northeast. There were 119 of them, all engravings after the drawings for a publication called American Scenery. The full title was American Scenery, or Land, Lake, and River Illustrations of a Transatlantic Nature. Transatlantic because Bartlett was British. His partner, a writer named Willis, was American. They got together, traveled the Northeast in order to get these images and stories to tell in American Scenery. It was published in England. That's because that's where all the engravers were, by a publisher named George Virtue between 1837 and 1849. So it took quite a while for these images in issues of 4 or 5 to be published over the course of about 4 or 5 years, or I'm sorry, 4 or 5 years. On the right is the terminus of what's called the Susquehanna Division from just above Harrisburg, which is actually Clark's Ferry at the time. Duncan Island, Duncannon is just below that, right at the mouth of the Juniata. Traveling on the west side of the river, using the river as a source for the canal water up to Northumberland. And we're actually looking at Northumberland on this view. The boats in the canal were hauled by mules all the way from Duncannon all the way up to Northumberland. On the left-hand side, you have the North Branch Division, which followed the North Branch of the Susquehanna from Northumberland, all the way past Wilkes-Barre, a distance of 72 miles. The Susquehanna Division on the right-hand side was completed in 1831. The North Branch Division was completed in 1834. And here we're looking downstream. Wilkes-Barre is hidden in the midground there on the left-hand side. And so both of these images are quite au courant, very contemporaneous with the time in which they were drawn by Bartlett for American Scenery. Finally, one commodity that wasn't in need of canals or ferries was timber. Here we have a lithograph after a drawing by Edwin Whitfield, view on the Susquehanna, not very far from Harrisburg at all, from a series called North America Scenery, published in 1846. You see the lone vehicle traveling over down in the right-hand side. There is a canoe here, but the sole vehicle on the river is this large log raft, which it represents the way that the timber companies moved large logs of white pine from the vast untouched regions of white pine in northern Pennsylvania and southern New York that cut everything down. And the way that they got them to market was to build rafts out of the logs and ship them down the Susquehanna River at high water. That is to say, when the snow has melted and it rose the river high enough so the logs could float, literally float. People lived on them for weeks in order to get them down the Susquehanna River. The problem with this image right here is that there's just one raft. at the time, there were probably as many as 500 of these things going by this particular point in a day. And so you would have seen tons more. And that might have been the reason why the publisher of North American Scenery actually had the scene redrawn. We don't have a copy of this in our collection on the right-hand side, but it more accurately depicts the number of rafts. You can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4. I think there's another one in view up here. And this is the way that you would see these rafts going down the river, particularly in the spring. You see the coloration is more appropriate for the movements of these things as well. The raft is still there in this last image that I'm going to show you. There in the foreground, again, another guy in the canoe, somebody out here, another canoe that's about ready to launch. But here's the log raft. Oh, actually, I forgot. There's another one. So there are actually two, and they're now floating past Harrisburg. They go all the way down to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay is where they ended up, and they were then redistributed to go at various locations. So this this continuation of these logs floating down the river. But what's important for our purposes is that, well, let me first describe this. The images for North American Scenery by Whitfield were accompanied by text written by a man named John Keyes, who was a well-known bibliophile in the middle part of the 19th century. And the text accompanying this particular view, this view of Harrisburg, reads like this: "At the mention of Harrisburg, we are apt to figure to ourselves the very fine, fresh-looking city upon the east bank of the Susquehanna, with its tasteful capitol surmounting the hill, the waterworks in the rear thereof, and its handsome bridges." Now, we can't show you the waterworks because it's actually not visible in this one, but the Capitol there on the at the top of the print was present. This particular is the first Capitol. It's called the Old Capitol Building. It's the state. Harrisburg was the state capital of Pennsylvania. It burned in 1897, so they had to rebuild it. Just below that is the Camelback Bridge. Remember, I mentioned that, constructed in 1816, and here in 1846, still standing and being used to cross the Susquehanna for both foot and carriage traffic between Harrisburg and a town called Wormleysburg, directly across from Harrisburg. And it opened again in 1816. The last bridge, the second bridge here, clearer to us, is the Cumberland Valley Railroad Bridge. It's the second bridge that was constructed. The first one was constructed in 1835, if I'm not mistaken, and burned down in 1844. And this one is newly opened, 1846, and it was used to direct railroad traffic from Harrisburg down to Chambersburg. And if you look very carefully, you can see that it's a double decker. The train is on the top deck, and the lower deck is for foot traffic below. And so you had a double use of this particular bridge. But the presence of this bridge and being depicted here in 1846 really marks the end of our exhibition, both in terms of the last images that would have been in the show if it were live in the museum, but also chronologically for early Pennsylvania landscape, because it really introduces a new age for Pennsylvania. Again, the Pennsylvania Railroad was chartered in 1846, which brings us really out of the era of early landscapes from the Tavern Collection and into the age of the railroad in Pennsylvania history. It's a time which really changed the nature of commerce, changed the nature of the way that we engage the landscape, and really a time when railroad imagery begins to dominate the Tavern Collection as well. It would be a great topic for another talk, but that's perhaps a good place for us to end our talk today.
Thank you for your introduction, Patrick. The exhibition seems quite fascinating, and I think I can revisit the history of Pennsylvania and the American scenery through this virtual exhibition.
Yeah, that's one of the great beauties of having a collection like the Tavern Collection, and that so much of Pennsylvania's history is embedded in the imagery. That really it can be a source for all kinds of exhibitions, not only, of course, just drawn from the collection, but a foundation for getting images, all kinds of images, and not only prints, but paintings, sculpture, all kinds of imagery for depicting 19th century painting, printmaking, whatever, in just about any direction you like to go. It's rich in subject material.
Yeah, it was great. So before we wrap up our webinar, I am wondering if anyone's have questions about the exhibition or the objects. Please raise your hand, or you can just put it in the Q&A box on the Zoom chat. We'll wait for a more minute, and yeah, if you don't have any questions, I think we should wrap up this webinar. So I hope everyone can visit the website of Palmer Museum of Art to see our virtual exhibition, and I will ponder our relationship with the land and its long memory through this exhibition. So, Patrick, do you have anything that you want to mention before we go?
Yeah, you can see the exhibition, of course, anytime you'd like online. However, the, the Palmer Museum of Art is open. You have to get tickets. They're free. You have to sign up for tickets. You can do it online, visiting the museum's website. You have to get tickets, but you can. We're open for business. There'll be very few people there at any given time, but please come. Lots of opportunities. And I see something in the chat room.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Oh,
there's a chat. Yeah.
it's just from our director.
Yeah, and also I got a Q&A, one more questions from Bala Kavar. Yeah, I think the participant is wondering she can get the magazine's name, Columbia magazine.
The Columbian Magazine. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
published 1786 to 1792. And if you just simply, if you want to go online, well, actually, you don't have to go online. Visit the museum's website and then look at the first two images in the exhibition, and you can link to the Columbian right there. And that link will take you to just about every monthly issue of the Columbian that was published.
Great to know that. And is there any other questions about our exhibition?
Yeah, let me, well, while we're waiting, I see another Q&A. Is that the same one?
Oh, no, there is another question. So, Patrick, can you tell us a little bit about how the prints were used and received by the public at the time they were made?
Well, that will take us into another talk, but it's a great question because there are actually multiple audiences for these images. For some of them, of course, as I mentioned earlier, they are illustrations that accompany articles or stand alone in a number of published works. The Columbian is one of a number of magazines that are represented in the exhibition. We have images from the Analectic magazine and from the Portfolio as well. And there are numerous other magazines in the late 18th and early 19th century that carry these images. And there's a very important reason for them. We won't get into it today, but it really was to proselytize for the American landscape, for America, the image of America and the land of America, and celebrating the brilliance of the beauty and brilliance of the American landscape. It was a very important topic for publishers and printmakers in the early years of our republic. But it was also a way to make money, especially as time went on and people began to produce these images. The majority images for the Tavern collection are town views. And so C.J. Corbin was not the only person who went into these towns, drew them, and then tried to sell them. Fowler was one, Bailey was another. There were a large number. As a matter of fact, there's a huge book that's been published on this by a guy named Reps, who talks about all the locations across the country. And it was a way for these publishers to make money, and they were not. It was they were providing a very nice product, but nonetheless, they did it because they knew that people would be interested in seeing their towns from these particular vantage points. And so that was a major motivating factor. There are also illustrations in books that have been extracted for the collection. Illustrations ranging from geology to the history of birds in this country. So there are a lot of different subjects in books in which images from Pennsylvania relating to Pennsylvania were extracted and found their way into the collection. It's a good question.
So do you have any other questions, participants? It looks like we've covered all of our questions. So thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you being here, and I hope everyone enjoyed the rest of your day.
Okay, thanks so
Patrick,
much for your
thank
help.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.